Thomas Carter ran a hand over the smooth navy blue wool of his suit jacket, the fabric of familiar comfort under his calloused fingertips. It was more than a suit. It was a repository of memories, a testament to a life spent in diligent, quiet pursuit of a dream that was not his own, but his son's. The faint scent of cedar from his closet clung to it, a smell he associated with preservation, with keeping precious things safe. He had worn this very suit 15 years ago, sitting in a sea of proud parents under the historic spires of Harvard Business School, his heart swelling with a pride so immense it felt like it could crack his ribs. He had watched his son Daniel walk across that stage, a young man forged in the crucible of his father's sacrifices, ready to conquer a world that had, for generations, offered men like them only back entrances and side doors. Today, that son, now a titan of industry, had asked him to walk through the front door, on the polished mahogany table of his modest but meticulously kept home. The invitation lay like a golden ticket. It was thick cardstock, the color of old money, with the words "The Whitmore Country Club" embossed in an elegant curling script. Daniel had handed it to him the day before, his usual commanding presence softened by a rare, almost boyish enthusiasm. "The final lunch, Dad," Daniel had said, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a victory hard won. "The signing is this afternoon, $1 billion deal. It's the one that changes everything." He had clasped Thomas's shoulder, his grip firm. "I want you there. None of this would exist without you." For 40 years, Thomas had been a public accountant. It was a profession of numbers, of balance sheets and ledgers, of finding order in the chaos of other people's finances. He had been good at it, respected for his integrity and his almost supernatural ability to spot a lie hidden in a column of figures. But it had been a life lived in the background, a life of quiet service. To support Daniel's ambition, that one steady job had often been supplemented by 2 others. He remembered the bone-deep weariness of stocking shelves at a grocery store late at night, the smell of disinfectant clinging to his clothes. He remembered the weekends spent driving a taxi, the faces of the city blurring past his window, each fare a small deposit into the bank account labeled Daniel's future. He had sold his own prized 1968 Ford Mustang, the car he had lovingly restored, bolt by bolt, so that Daniel could buy his first company truck, a rusty, temperamental machine that had become the cornerstone of an empire. He had never once called these things sacrifices. They were investments. And today, sitting in the main hall of the Whitmore Country Club, he was about to see the dividend declared. As he adjusted the knot of his silk tie, the one Daniel had given him last Christmas, Thomas felt a tremor of apprehension beneath his pride. He knew of the Whitmores, of course. They were a dynasty, a name synonymous with inherited power and impenetrable social circles. They were the kind of people who owned things, not the kind of people who built them. Daniel had been negotiating with their firm, the Whitmore Group, for a merger that would catapult Carter Logistics from a national powerhouse into a global behemoth. Daniel had called it a partnership of equals, but Thomas, a man who had spent his life reading the fine print, knew that some people never truly saw others as their equals. He gave his reflection a final, critical look. The suit, though 15 years old, was immaculate. His shoes were shined to a mirror finish. His graying hair was neatly combed. He was Thomas Carter, father of Daniel Carter, CEO. He was a guest. He belonged here. With a deep breath that did little to quell the fluttering in his chest, he picked up the golden invitation and walked out of his home, heading towards a world he had only ever seen from the outside. Meanwhile, 30 floors above the bustling streets of Manhattan, Daniel Carter stood before a panoramic window in his office, the city spreading out beneath him like a circuit board of infinite possibility. At 38, he was the architect of a logistics empire worth $800 million. A valuation that was, in a few hours, set to more than double. The merger with the Whitmore Group was the crowning achievement of a decade of relentless, 17-hour days. It was the move that would silence the last of the doubters, the ones who had dismissed him as a novelty, a diversity initiative, a man who had gotten lucky. He turned from the window and looked at the framed photograph on his desk. It was of him and his father, taken on the day he'd bought that first rusty truck. They stood with their arms around each other, grinning, their faces smudged with grease. In his father's eyes, he saw not the exhaustion of a man working 3 jobs, but the fierce, unyielding light of belief. "You still think this is a good idea?" A sharp voice cut through his reverie. Natasha Rodriguez, his chief legal counsel and best friend since their days at Harvard, leaned against the doorframe, a file tucked under her arm. She was a whirlwind of intellect and ferocity, a woman who, had fought her way out of the same rough neighborhood as Daniel to become one of New York's most feared corporate lawyers. Having my father at the signing, Daniel asked, turning back to the window, it's the only idea. He's the reason Carter Logistics exists. He needs to see this. I'm not talking about your father, Danny. I'm talking about the Whitmores, she said, walking into the office and dropping the file on his desk. I've been through their financials with a fine-tooth comb, and I've had Marcus digging into their history. There's something polished about them. Too polished. Old money like that doesn't get that rich without cutting some dark corners. Marcus Williams was the third pillar of their team, a former FBI investigator specializing in white-collar crime whom Daniel kept on a quiet, permanent retainer for the last 6 months. As negotiations progressed, Marcus had been compiling a comprehensive, discreet dossier on the Whitmore family. It was standard practice for Daniel due diligence, but with the Whitmores he had told Marcus to dig deeper. It was a gut feeling, a prickle of unease he couldn't shake. They're aristocrats, Nat, Daniel said with a shrug. Their corners have been dark for generations. As long as the merger is sound, their history is their business. Is it? She challenged, her eyes narrowing. People like that, they have a certain way of looking at the world. At people like us. I just don't want your father walking into a situation he's not prepared for. Daniel smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. My father has been walking into situations he wasn't prepared for his entire life, and he has never once flinched. He taught me everything I know about dignity. He'll be fine. He picked up his briefcase, the weight of the billion-dollar contracts inside feeling less significant than the weight of the golden invitation he had handed his father. He was bringing his two worlds together, the world of his past, embodied by the unwavering integrity of Thomas Carter, and the world of his future, represented by the gilded power of the wit. He believed, with the unshakable confidence of a man who had bent reality to his will, that he could make them coexist. It was a belief that would be shattered before the appetizers were even served. The Whitmore Country Club did not sit on the land, it dominated it. It was a sprawling Georgian mansion of red brick and white pillars, set amidst acres of unnaturally green lawn that rolled down to a serene, man-made lake. The air itself seemed different, here thinner, cleaner, rarefied. It was the kind of place where wealth was not displayed but simply presumed, where silence was the ultimate luxury. Thomas Carter's modest sedan felt glaringly out of place in the parking lot, nestled between a gleaming black Bentley and a silver Aston Martin. As he stepped out, the crunch of his leather shoes on the meticulously raked gravel sounded jarringly loud in the afternoon stillness. He clutched the golden invitation in his hand, its sharp corners digging into his palm, a tangible link to his right to be here. He walked up the sweeping stone steps and through a set of colossal oak doors, entering a lobby that seemed designed to diminish the individual. The ceiling soared 2 stories high, from which a crystal chandelier the size of a small car dripped light onto a floor of black and white marble tiles, polished to a dizzying sheen. The only sounds were the hushed murmur of conversation from a distant hall and the funereal ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. A young woman with blonde hair pulled into a severe bun sat behind a ridiculously ornate desk. Her expression was a carefully curated blend of boredom and disdain. Thomas approached, a polite smile on his face. "Good afternoon," he began, holding out the invitation. "I'm here for the Carter Whitmore lunch." The receptionist's eyes flickered from his face, down to his suit, and then to the invitation. Lingering on it for a beat too long, she did not take it. Her lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. "Sir," she began, her voice sharp and carrying an edge of practiced condescension that echoed through the vast, empty space. "Deliveries and cleaning staff must use the back entrance." The words hung in the air, each one a tiny, poisoned dart. Thomas's confident stride, the stride of a man who had earned his place, faltered and then stopped. He stood frozen on the marble, a sudden, disorienting wave of confusion washing over him. He felt the weight of the 63 years of his life, of the 3 jobs, of the sold Mustang, of the endless nights studying so his son could have a better life. He was clutching a golden invitation to celebrate the pinnacle of that life, and he was being told to go to the back door. "Excuse me," he managed, his voice hoarser than he intended. "There must be a misunderstanding. I'm an invited guest for my son's business lunch." "Of course you are," a voice murmured, dripping with a sweetness that failed to conceal its venomous intent. Victoria Whitmore emerged from a nearby hallway, moving across the marble floor with a predatory grace. She was a woman in her late 50s, rail-thin and draped in a Chanel suit the color of cream. Her heels clicked on the marble like hammers, delivering a sentence, a rhythmic, unforgiving sound that drew the eye. A cold, reptilian smile was plastered on her face. She stopped a few feet from Thomas, her eyes performing the same dismissive inventory as the receptionist's, only slower, more deliberate, more insulting. "Let me guess," she said, her voice a theatrical whisper that carried to every corner of the lobby. "You must be the new gardener, or perhaps the driver. Did you get lost on your way to the staff quarters?" Her laughter, a crystal-clear, tinkling sound, broke the silence. It was not a sound of mirth, but of cruelty. It acted as a signal, a call to arms for the other guests who had begun to drift into the lobby. They turned as one, their faces a gallery of morbid curiosity. There were men in exquisite Italian suits, women adorned with jewels that caught the light of the chandelier. They were the heirs to old fortunes, the gatekeepers of this gilded world, and they watched the unfolding spectacle with the detached interest of a scientist observing a lesser life form under a microscope. Thomas felt a hot flush creep up his neck, the familiar, searing heat of humiliation. But 40 years of navigating a world that often judged him on sight had taught him the art of composure. He would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He squared his shoulders, looked Victoria Whitmore directly in her cold blue eyes, and spoke with a clarity that belied the turmoil in his chest. "I am Thomas Carter," he said, his voice steady, "father of Daniel Carter, CEO of Carter Logistics." Across the room, near the entrance to the main dining hall, Daniel Carter watched the scene play out as if in slow motion. He had just concluded a brief, congratulatory chat with one of the Whitmore Group's board members and was turning to find his father. Then he saw him, standing isolated in the center of the vast lobby, a solitary, dignified figure surrounded by circling sharks. He saw the receptionist sneer. He saw Victoria Whitmore's predatory approach. He heard her crystalline laughter echo off the cold marble dot, and as he saw the look of calculated contempt in Victoria's eyes, the look she directed at the man who had raised him alone after his mother's untimely death, something cold and terrifyingly familiar took hold of his chest and squeezed. It was the same feeling he'd had as a 7-year-old boy, watching his father stand silently at the back of a crowded room during a parent-teacher meeting at his private school. He had watched as the other parents, wealthy and white, had talked over and around his father, assuming from his simple clothes and tired eyes that he had nothing of value, financially or otherwise, to contribute. He remembered the quiet, unshakable dignity with which his father had endured their dismissiveness then, and he saw that same look on his face now. It was the expression of a man who had worked himself to the bone so his son could attend those same private schools. A man who had absorbed 1,000 tiny cuts of disrespect over a lifetime so that his son would be armored enough to one day stand in rooms like this as an equal. Thomas remained motionless, a statue of forbearance, but Daniel knew that look. He could read the history of sacrifice in the set of his father's jaw, in the stillness of his hands. Victoria, oblivious to the storm gathering across the room, clapped her hands together theatrically, a gesture of mock delight. "Oh, how sweet," she exclaimed, her voice ringing with false cheer. "The boy brought his daddy along to see how the adults do real business. How touching." She turned to her audience, a queen holding court. "I'm sure there's some yard work available out back if you're looking for a job," she continued, her gaze fixed on Thomas. "Or maybe we can find something for you in the kitchen." One of Richard Whitmore's partners, a portly man, with a flushed face and a laugh that sounded like a horse's whinny, muttered something about knowing one's place, just loud enough for everyone to hear. A ripple of whispers spread through the assembled guests, creating a vortex of humiliation that tightened around the man who had dedicated his entire life to building dignity through honest, unglamorous work. That was when Daniel moved. The quiet murmurs ceased as he strode across the marble floor. He did not rush. His steps were measured, deliberate, each one landing with a soft, authoritative thud that seemed to absorb all other sound in the room. He walked straight to his father, ignoring the curious, startled glances of the other guests. He reached out and put his arm around Thomas's shoulders, a gesture of such profound tenderness and solidarity that it felt like a shield. He then turned his head and looked directly into Victoria Whitmore's eyes. He did not glower, he did not raise his voice. He simply met her gaze with a calmness so absolute, so chilling, that it silenced the entire cavernous space. The grandfather clock's ticking suddenly seemed deafening. "This man," Daniel said, his voice quiet but resonating with a power that filled the room, "taught me that dignity cannot be bought or sold." He paused, letting the words land. "And you," he continued, his eyes still locked on Victoria's, have just taught me a very valuable lesson about who I choose to do business with. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick, heavy, and fraught with the sudden, terrifying understanding that a line had been crossed, and that the man who had just spoken was not a man to be trifled with. Thomas looked up at his son, a small, proud smile finally breaking through his stoic composure. 40 years of investment. It had all been worth it for this single, breathtaking moment. What Victoria Whitmore didn't know, what no one in that room could possibly comprehend, was that she had just declared war on precisely the wrong man. The humiliation was not an end, but a beginning, and the events of the next few hours would turn her casual arrogance into the single most expensive mistake of her billionaire life. Victoria Whitmore, drunk on the intoxicating liquor of her own superiority, was not one to recognize the rumble of an approaching earthquake. To her, Daniel's quiet defiance was not a threat but an impudence, a breach of protocol that required a firmer, more public hand. She decided to turn the moment into a full-blown spectacle, to crush this audacity under the full weight of the Whitmore name. "Richard," she called out, her voice sharp and imperious, cutting through the tense silence. "Richard, darling, come and meet the father of our new partner." Her husband, Richard Whitmore, who had been holding court by the bar with a group of equally affluent men, turned. He was a man built of soft living and inherited arrogance, with a Cuban cigar clamped between his fingers like a scepter. He ambled over, his eyes performing the same cold, head-to-toe evaluation of Thomas as if inspecting livestock for purchase. "Impressive," Richard commented, not to Thomas, but to his wife, completely ignoring the presence of both father and son as if they were pieces of furniture. "How they can dress themselves up properly when necessary." Thomas felt each word like a physical blow, a sharp jab to his soul, but his expression remained a mask of placid composure. Decades ago, he had learned a fundamental truth: reacting with anger to contempt only serves to feed the ego of the person dispensing it. Silence and dignity were his shields, and they had never failed him. Daniel watched everything, his mind a cold, precise recording device, cataloging every sneering insult, every cruel laugh, every condescending glance from the assembled guests. He was no longer just a son watching his father be insulted. He was a CEO gathering data. "Dad worked for 40 years as a public accountant," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the mocking murmur that had begun to rise again. "3 jobs at once so I could go to college." Victoria let out another one of her crystalline laughs, this one laced with undisguised mockery. What a touching story. "And now the little boy wants to play businessman with the grown-ups." She gestured theatrically to the other guests, her bracelets jangling. "Just imagine. From a neighborhood accountant to a near billionaire in a single generation. How wonderfully American." What she, in her monumental arrogance, could not possibly know was that Thomas Carter had not been just any accountant. For 40 years, he had been a quiet crusader. He had audited mid-sized companies with a forensic passion, uncovering sophisticated tax frauds, identifying complex money laundering schemes, and exposing rackets that respectable businessmen believed to be perfectly hidden. His reputation for absolute, incorruptible integrity was the stuff of legend among a select circle of federal judges and top-tier law firms. As Victoria continued her cruel performance, Thomas's mind drifted back. He remembered the countless sleepless nights spent poring over dense legal texts to help a young Daniel understand the serpentine clauses of his first complex contracts. He remembered the Saturday mornings at their small kitchen table, teaching his son how to read a balance sheet, how to see the story that the numbers told. He remembered the silent, overwhelming pride that had filled him when Daniel, using those very lessons, had closed his first $1 million deal. "You know, honey," Richard said to his wife, his voice booming with performative authority, "maybe we should reconsider this merger. We don't want the Whitmore reputation associated with certain origins." That was the moment something in the room's atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, charged with a new kind of energy. Daniel didn't change his posture, he didn't raise his voice, but everyone around him, from the smirking guests to the nervous club staff, felt a palpable change emanating from him. It was as if a storm, long dormant, was beginning to brew, in what had appeared to be calm waters. "An interesting perspective, Richard," Daniel replied, his eyes fixed on the older man, especially coming from someone whose family fortune was built on the back of grossly overpriced government contracts in the 1980s. The silence that followed was different. It was not merely tense. It was sharp, brittle, and edged with shock. Richard Whitmore choked audibly on his cigar smoke, his eyes narrowing into slits. Excuse me. Daniel smiled for the first time since entering the club. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator that had patiently waited for its prey to wander into the perfect trap. Oh, I research my business partners very, very well, Richard, especially those who have such a fondness for judging other people's origins. Victoria, sensing a disastrous loss of control, tried to intervene. Now, see here, young man. No, Daniel interrupted, his voice still gentle but now imbued with an unyielding authority that stopped her cold. You're going to listen. He slowly panned his gaze across the group of guests, many of whom now looked distinctly uncomfortable, their amusement replaced by a dawning sense of dread. My father taught me that character isn't something you inherit, it's something you build, day by day, choice by choice. He taught me that dignity isn't something you can buy, it's something you earn. And he taught me that not all money is worth earning. Thomas watched his son, a mixture of immense pride and a father's innate concern swirling within him. He knew that look in Daniel's eyes. It was the same look of grim, unbreakable determination Daniel had worn at 12 years old when he'd first declared he would become a businessman so that no child would ever have to see his father work 3 jobs just to keep their heads above water. What the Whitmores failed to realize was that their every derogatory word, every classist comment, was not just an insult disappearing into the ether. It was being meticulously documented by the discreet cell phones of several younger guests, individuals from a generation less tolerant of such blatant bigotry. Every sneer was becoming a pixel, every cruel laugh a soundbite evidence that would be impossible to deny later. Bradley Whitmore, the youngest son of the family, a man in his late 20s who seemed to possess a conscience his parents lacked, stepped forward, his face etched with anxiety. Dad, Mom, maybe we're taking this joke a bit too far. A joke? Thomas spoke for the first time since the ordeal began. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of quiet endurance, and it commanded attention. He looked directly at Bradley, but his words were for the entire room. Son, this isn't a joke. This is an education. This is a rare opportunity to see how some people reveal their true character when they believe there are no consequences for their actions. Victoria, now visibly irritated by the sheer audacity of being confronted in her own domain, decided to escalate the humiliation to its final, irrevocable conclusion. Security, she shrieked, her voice cracking with rage as she pointed a trembling diamond-clad finger at Thomas and Daniel. Security, we have some individuals here who are clearly lost. Please escort them out. It was in that precise moment that Daniel Carter realized he had made a critical miscalculation. He had underestimated the sheer, bottomless depth of the Whitmore family's arrogance. It was also the moment he decided, with ice-cold certainty, that the billion-dollar merger, the deal that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of his entire business career, had just become utterly secondary to something much more fundamental, much more important. As 2 large security guards in dark suits approached, their steps hesitant, their faces a mask of professional discomfort, Daniel maintained a calm that intrigued even his father. It was as if he had not only anticipated this escalation but had been waiting for it. He had been waiting for the Whitmores to show their complete hand, to reveal the final, ugly truth of their character before he revealed what he truly knew about them. Each new humiliation, each fresh wave of contempt, only served to strengthen something inside him that his oppressors could not see. A resolve that had been forged in the fire of watching his father face down a lifetime of prejudice, with unwavering dignity, now combined with a cache of information that would make any seasoned executive lose sleep for a month. This was no longer a business negotiation. It was a reckoning. The walk to the parking lot was conducted in a thick, ringing silence. Daniel's arm remained firmly around his father's shoulders, a silent bulwark against the waves of humiliation that radiated from the grand clubhouse behind them. Thomas's mind was a whirlwind, replaying the sneering faces and cutting words, trying to process the raw, public nature of the assault on his dignity. But his son's mind was already 3 steps ahead, a high-speed processor calculating variables, charting courses, and preparing for a war the enemy didn't even know had been declared. Dad, Daniel said softly, his voice breaking the tense quiet as he opened the passenger door of his Lincoln Navigator. The interior was a sanctuary of cool leather and hushed quiet. I need you to trust me now, more than you ever have before. Thomas looked away from the imposing facade of the country club and met his son's gaze. He saw something in those eyes that was both deeply familiar and startlingly new. It was the cold, hard glint of determination that Thomas himself had felt 40 years earlier, on the day he decided he would never again allow another human being to determine the value of his dignity based on the color of his skin or the size of his bank account. But mixed with that familiar fire was a strategic coldness, a tactical patience that was entirely Daniel's own. He saw the accountant's precision married to the CEO's power. He nodded slowly. Always, son. As the navigator pulled silently away from the manicured grounds, Daniel was already on his phone. It rang only once before it was answered. Natasha. Daniel. What's wrong? You're supposed to be celebrating. Natasha Rodriguez's voice was sharp, instantly alert. She could read a crisis in a single word. Change of plans, Daniel said, his voice a low, dangerous calm. He glanced at his father, who was staring silently out the window at the passing landscape of wealth and privilege. I need everything you and Marcus have on the Whitmore family. Government contracts, sealed court settlements, political connections, every piece of dark laundry they've ever tried to hide. I want it all, on the main conference table, in 1 hour. Daniel, what happened? She asked, the sound of furious typing already audible in the background. They made the mistake of showing their true colors. Daniel replied, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, to the wrong person. For the last 6 months of negotiations, Daniel's quiet investigation into the Whitmores had been humming along in the background. It had started, not out of specific suspicion, but out of a business prudence his father had drilled into him. Know your partners, better than they know themselves. What he and his team had uncovered had been filed away in encrypted folders, labeled as contingency. Now, every redacted name, every sealed document, every questionable transaction in those reports was about to be activated. The contingency was here. Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore Country Club, the family and their guests were celebrating what they considered a swift and decisive victory. Victoria, her composure restored, held a flute of Dom Perignon aloft. Toast, she announced to the room, to maintaining standards. Richard laughed, his arm around her waist. Did you see how quickly they left? As soon as you showed them a little authority, they always back down. It's in their nature. Bradley, the youngest son, shifted uncomfortably. Mum, Dad, maybe we overreacted. Daniel Carter isn't some small-time operator. Carter Logistics is a serious player. Please, Victoria waved his concern away with a flick of her wrist, a gesture full of dismissive elegance. He's a backyard businessman who got too big for his boots, a novelty. Mark my words, he'll be back tomorrow morning, tail between his legs, begging to sign that contract. What Victoria Whitmore, in her diamond-encrusted bubble of blissful ignorance, did not know was that at that very moment, Daniel Carter was stepping out of an elevator onto the 40th floor of his corporate building, into a war room staffed by a team she could never have imagined existed. Natasha was already there, flanked by 3 paralegals, with 3 large document boxes open on the massive glass conference table. With her was Marcus Williams, the ex-FBI investigator, a man whose placid exterior concealed a mind like a steel trap. He was connecting his laptop to the room's main screen. Daniel, Marcus began without preamble, his movements efficient and precise as he spread a series of glossy photographs and complex spreadsheets across the table. You're not going to believe what we've been able to confirm in the last 6 months. The findings were devastating. They were a portrait of a family dynasty built not just on business acumen, but on systemic corruption and exploitation. These, Marcus said, pointing to a stack of papers, are the Defense Department contracts from the 80s. We found evidence of systematic overbilling, charging the government for materials never delivered and hours never worked. It's all past the statute of limitations, of course, but the paper trail is undeniable. Natasha stepped forward, her finger tapping on a different document, this one bearing the unmistakable stamp of a court seal. This is where it gets actionable. This is a sealed settlement for $2 million, paid to a black family in 2010. They sued Whitmore Industries for systematic racial discrimination. The family was forced into an ironclad confidentiality agreement as part of the deal. She pushed more files across the table, and here's another. $1.5 million to an engineer, Roberto Silva, fired a week after he formally questioned why no black or Latino employees were ever promoted to executive positions. Same story. Crushing NDA. Daniel studied each page, his face a mask of cold concentration. This wasn't just about questionable business deals. It was a pattern of behavior, a corporate culture of prejudice that spanned decades. His father's humiliation hadn't been an isolated incident of personal arrogance. It had been the public manifestation of a deep, systemic rot. There's more, Marcus said. As the main screen flickered to life, a list of names appeared. We found 7 former employees, all people of color, all fired under suspicious circumstances, all bound by similar confidentiality agreements. They were scared to talk, but NDAs are designed to intimidate individuals, not to withstand a coordinated legal assault. Natasha finished, a predatory gleam in her eyes. They all received a call from my office an hour ago. All 7 have agreed to break their silence. Simultaneously, Thomas Carter, who had been sitting silently at the head of the table throughout the presentation, watched his son orchestrate this complex symphony of legal and financial warfare. He was witnessing something that had clearly been months, if not years, in the making. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Son," he said, meeting Daniel's eyes. "Did you know this was going to happen today?" Daniel turned to his father, and for the first time the mask of cold determination cracked, revealing a flicker of deep sadness mixed with resolve. "I didn't know it would be you, Dad. I didn't know it would be today. But I knew that sooner or later, they would show their true colors. People like the Whitmores, they can't hide who they are forever. Their entitlement is a poison that eventually seeps out." Natasha interrupted the family moment, her focus entirely on the strategic opportunity before them. "Daniel, we have a window here. The merger agreement hasn't been officially cancelled. Technically, you can still go back tomorrow and sign." "Why in God's name would I do that?" Daniel asked, turning to her. "Because," Natasha smiled, a smile of pure, tactical ferocity. "Imagine the impact. Imagine the headlines. When they find out that the man they humiliated today, the man they tried to throw out the back door, has enough information to destroy not only their business, but the carefully constructed, multi-generational myth of their family's reputation." Daniel walked to the panoramic window, looking out at the lights of New York beginning to twinkle. On in the descending twilight, each point of light represented a story, a family, a dream being built or destroyed by decisions made in rooms just like this one. Marcus broke the silence. "There's something else you need to know, Daniel. The liquidity report we ran last month. The merger between Carter Logistics and the Whitmore Group isn't just beneficial for you, it's essential for them. Their other divisions are underperforming. Without this deal, without your capital infusion and logistics network, they have a serious cash flow problem within 18 months. A slow smile spread across Thomas Carter's face for the first time since they had left the club. "So," he said, the accountant in him instantly grasping the implication, "that's far more than we need them." "Exactly," Natasha confirmed. "And now, Daniel has something they never in their wildest dreams expected him to have: leverage. The power to choose not only whether this deal happens, but on what terms it happens." Daniel remained silent. For several long minutes, his back to the room, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was processing not just the financial data and legal strategies, but the profound moral weight of the decision he was about to make. This was no longer a simple business agreement. It had morphed into a battle for justice, a conflict that transcended contracts and balance sheets. When he finally turned back to face his team, his eyes shone with a new, terrifying intensity, an energy that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. It was the look of a man who had found the exact, perfect intersection where moral principle meets strategic power. It was a combination the Whitmore family would learn to fear over the next 24 hours. The humiliation of Thomas Carter had been the spark. What was coming now was the explosion. The next morning, Daniel Carter walked through the colossal oak doors of the Whitmore Country Club for the second time. He wore the same immaculate suit he had worn the day before, but he moved with a different energy. The quiet dignity of yesterday had been replaced by the focused, lethal grace of a predator entering its killing ground. Victoria and Richard Whitmore awaited him in the main hall, a room that had been rearranged for the occasion. The polished, mahogany table from the club's boardroom had been brought in, and on it lay the stack of contracts, a billion-dollar monument to their impending victory. They were radiant with confidence, flanked by their lawyers and a hand-picked group of financial journalists summoned to witness and document their triumph. "I knew you'd come back," Victoria murmured as Daniel approached, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for him. A triumphant, reptilian smile played on her lips. "People like you always come crawling back when reality hits." Daniel returned her smile with one of his own, a calm, almost beatific expression that seemed to unsettle her. He placed his sleek, leather briefcase on the table, its soft click echoing in the expectant silence. "You're right, Victoria. I did come to sign an agreement today," he said, his voice clear and steady. "It's just not the agreement you're expecting. But First shadow of confusion flickered across Richard's face as Daniel opened his briefcase. Instead of taking out the gold-plated fountain pen they had set out for him, he withdrew a thick, sealed manila envelope. "Before we talk about mergers," Daniel began, his tone pleasant, as if discussing the weather, "I feel a need to clear up a few misunderstandings about the Whitmore family's legacy." Victoria laughed, a brittle forced sound that lacked the effortless cruelty of the day before. "What kind of absurd charade is this, young man?" Daniel ignored her, opening the envelope and sliding a series of glossy 8x10 photographs across the polished surface of the table, fanning them out like a poker hand. "This," he said, tapping the first photo of a young Hispanic woman, "is Jennifer Martinez, fired from your textile division in 2010 after reporting sexual harassment by 2 of her white supervisors. Your company paid her $2 million to sign a confidentiality agreement and disappear." He tapped the next photo, and here we have Roberto Silva, a brilliant engineer with 15 years of loyal service to your company, fired 1 week after he sent a formal memo questioning why Black and Latino employees were never promoted to executive positions. His settlement was $1.5 million. The silence that descended upon the room was unlike anything the club had ever witnessed. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. The journalists, sensing a story far bigger than a simple merger, began to edge forward. Richard, his face turning a blotchy red, tried to interrupt, his voice sputtering. "Listen here, those are confidential, sealed documents." "They were confidential," Daniel continued relentlessly, his voice never rising, which only made his words more devastating. He pulled more papers from the folder, until 7 former employees, all of whom you silenced with money and fear, decided to break their confidentiality agreements. Simultaneously, this morning, they are all, as we speak, giving depositions about the systemic environment of racial and sexual discrimination at Whitmore Industries. Victoria had gone visibly pale, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the sudden lack of blood in her face. "You can't prove anything. It's hearsay." Daniel calmly opened his laptop, which he had placed on the table, and swiveled the screen to face them. He projected a spreadsheet onto the large white wall behind the table. It was a stark, brutal grid of data. "Data from the last 15 years of your company's HR records," he said, his voice taking on an almost professorial tone. 0 Black employees in C-suite executive positions. A 300% higher termination rate for non-white employees compared to their white counterparts. Consistently, demonstrably lower salaries for women and people of color in the exact same jobs. He looked up from the screen and met Victoria's eyes. "Mathematics doesn't lie, Victoria." The journalists, who had been in a state of stunned silence, erupted into action. Cameras flashed, shutters clicked, and the frantic tapping of fingers on phone screens filled the room. Richard, desperate, tried to regain control. "This is an ambush. This is slander. You can't use—" "I can, and I will," Daniel interrupted smoothly. He connected a small digital recorder to the room's high-end sound system, including this. Victoria's own voice, dripping with contempt, suddenly echoed through the hall. "I'm sure there's some gardening work available out back if you're looking for a job." It was followed by Richard's cruel, braying laughter, and his comment about knowing his place. Victoria shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor and toppling over. "You had no right to record that," she shrieked, her facade of aristocratic grace completely shattered. "Actually, I did," Daniel replied calmly. "You were in a public space, with multiple witnesses. It's perfectly admissible." He clicked off the recorder. "But that, as I said, is just the appetizer." On cue, the doors to the hall opened, and Natasha Rodriguez strode in. She carried a second briefcase, even bulkier than Daniel's, and moved with the focused intensity of a panther. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," she announced, her voice resonating with legal authority. "I am Natasha Rodriguez. I am the legal representative of the 7 former employees who, as of 9 a.m. this morning, have filed a class action lawsuit against your companies. We are seeking $50 million in damages for systemic discrimination, wrongful termination, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." Richard staggered back a step, clutching his chest. This is extortion. This is justice," Daniel replied, closing his laptop. "And I'm still not done." He turned to the stunned group of journalists. "Members of the press, in exactly 5 minutes, you will each receive an email containing a complete dossier on the Whitmore family's discriminatory practices, including the recordings you just heard, copies of the sworn testimonials, and some rather interesting tax documentation. Victoria tried one last, desperate gambit. You're destroying your own career. No one in this city will ever want to do business with someone who breaks confidentiality like this. Daniel smiled for the first time with what looked like genuine satisfaction. It's funny you should mention confidentiality, Victoria, because my research team just discovered something fascinating about those overpriced government defense contracts your father secured in the 1980s. He motioned to the door again, and Marcus Williams entered, carrying 2 large banker's boxes overflowing with documents. Systematic tax fraud, Marcus listed methodically, his voice flat and emotionless. Defense contract overbill to the tune of $200 million in today's dollars. Bribery of government officials to secure land permits. He paused. All past the statute of limitations for criminal charges, of course, but more than enough to destroy any remaining shred of corporate reputation you might have left. It was then, and only then, that Richard Whitmore seemed to fully comprehend the scale of the catastrophe. This wasn't just an angry executive lashing out. They hadn't just provoked a man, they had provoked a strategic genius who possessed the resources, the intelligence, and most terrifyingly, the patience to orchestrate their systematic and entirely legal destruction. Bradley Whitmore, who had remained ghost-white and silent throughout the proceedings, finally whispered to his father, his voice hoarse with terror, "Dad, without the merger and with these lawsuits, the company will be bankrupt in 6 months. We'll lose everything." Daniel overheard the whisper. He turned his head slowly and looked at the family's youngest son. "Bradley, you appear to be the only one in this family with fully functioning brain cells, so I have a proposal for you. Don't you dare talk to my son." Victoria screamed, her voice a hysterical, ragged sound. "Calm down, Mom," Bradley snapped back, his eyes staring intently at Daniel, a dawning horror and a flicker of desperate hope on his face. "What proposal?" "Carter Logistics will acquire the operating assets of Whitmore Industries for 40 cents on the dollar of their current valuation," Daniel stated calmly. "A fair price, considering what's about to happen to the company's stock and public reputation." He paused, letting the weight of the offer settle. "That deal allows you and your parents to keep your homes and a modest personal income. The alternative is total bankruptcy, protracted public humiliation, and potential civil charges." Richard tried to protest, but Victoria, for the first time in her life, silenced him with a sharp gesture. The matriarch of the Whitmore family was finally, utterly speechless. Daniel calmly gathered his documents and slid them back into his briefcase. "You have 48 hours to accept the offer. After that, it expires, and you will be left to face the consequences of 40 years of arrogance and discrimination entirely on your own." He walked towards the exit, his father falling into step beside him, his face a mask of profound, quiet pride. As he reached the door, Daniel turned one last time and looked at Victoria. "Oh, and Victoria," he said, his voice soft but carrying, across the silent room, "about that comment you made yesterday, my father really could do some wonderful gardening here." He smiled, as the new owner of the establishment. The slam of the hall door echoed like a judge's gavel, sealing a sentence. In the devastating silence that followed, 3 generations of privilege, power, and prejudice began to crumble, like a house of cards caught in a storm they themselves had created. The fallout was not a storm, it was a tidal wave. Over the next 24 hours, the headlines spread like wildfire across every major news outlet. Billionaire family exposed for systematic discrimination. Black CEO cancels billion-dollar merger after father's public humiliation. The Whitmore papers' leaked documents revealed decades of corporate racism and corruption. The story had everything: class, race, hubris, and a spectacular, meticulously planned fall from grace. The court of public opinion delivered its verdict swiftly and brutally. 47 hours after Daniel had walked out of the country club, his phone rang. It was Bradley Whitmore. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. "I accept your offer." Bradley's voice was broken, stripped of the easy confidence of inherited wealth, replaced by the weary resignation of a man forced to bury the legacy of his entire family. "My parents, they're incapable of accepting reality. But I have young children. I can't let them pay the price for their grandparents' prejudice." 6 months later, the opulent hall of the Whitmore Country Club was unrecognizable. The heavy velvet curtains were gone, replaced by large windows that flooded the space with natural light. The stuffy portraits of stern-faced Whitmore ancestors had been taken down, their places now filled with vibrant artwork created by local teenagers. The sign out front no longer read the Whitmore Country Club. it now said. The Carter Community Center, what had once been an exclusive sanctuary for the white elite, had been transformed. It was now a bustling hub of opportunity, offering free music lessons, educational tutoring, and job training programs for young people from the city's most disadvantaged neighborhoods. Thomas Carter, now 64, walked through the magnificent gardens he had helped redesign. He was not a paid gardener, but a volunteer landscape consultant, his hands the same hands Victoria had scorned, deep in the rich soil, teaching a group of children about sustainable agriculture in the very spot where he had been told to look for work. "Dad," Daniel said, approaching him. A group of Black and Latino teenagers were in the background, practicing the violin in what had once been the Whitmore's exclusive members-only dining room. "Remember when she asked if you were looking for a job in gardening?" Thomas smiled, wiping a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "She was right," he said, his eyes twinkling. "I was looking for a job in gardening. I just didn't know it would be planting seeds of dignity in a place where only contempt had grown before." Daniel's own transformation had been just as profound. Carter Logistics had not only survived the cancellation of the Whitmore merger, it had prospered spectacularly. Impressed by Daniel's unwavering ethical stance during the scandal, 3 major corporations had approached him, offering partnerships that were collectively worth more than the original deal. The company now employed over 5,000 people, with a revolutionary diversity and inclusion policy that was being studied as a national model for ethical capitalism. The Whitmores, on the other hand, had become ghosts. Victoria was a complete social pariah, locked away in her mansion. Her invitations to charity galas were rescinded, the golf club terminated her lifetime membership, and even her personal stylists publicly announced they would no longer work with her. Richard, after being released from the hospital following a nervous breakdown, had retreated to a modest home in Florida, a recluse living off the small pension negotiated in the forced sale of his empire. Bradley had taken a different path. He had used a portion of the money from the sale to establish a non-profit organization dedicated to combating systemic discrimination in corporate America. "My family has caused pain for generations," he explained in a televised interview that went viral. "Now, I'm going to devote the rest of my life to trying to repair some of that damage." Natasha Rodriguez, now a minority partner in the vastly expanded Carter Logistics, often joked with Daniel about the irony of it all. "They thought they were humiliating you and your father," she would laugh during board meetings. "In reality, they were handing us the single greatest growth opportunity in our history on a silver platter." A year after the confrontation, Daniel received the National Award for Ethical Business Leadership. At the gala, standing on a stage under bright lights, he dedicated the award to his father. "Thomas Carter taught me that true power isn't about subjugating others, but about lifting up those around you," he said to the applauding crowd. "He taught me that the best revenge against prejudice isn't to destroy those who discriminate against us. It's to build a world so successful, so just, and so full of opportunity that their discrimination becomes utterly irrelevant." The audience, Thomas wiped a tear from his eye as he gave his son a standing ovation. At his side sat Jennifer Martinez, Roberto Silva, and the other former Whitmore employees who had found the courage to speak out. They were now all in senior leadership positions at Carter Logistics. Their voices finally heard, their talents finally recognized. The story of the Carters and the Whitmores became more than just a business headline. Universities began teaching the Carter case in their business ethics classes. Young entrepreneurs from minority backgrounds cited Daniel as an inspiration, a blueprint for how moral values could be a more powerful asset than any contract. And in communities across the country where children grew up facing the same casual prejudices his father had endured, the story became a legend, whispered with a new sense of hope. Victoria Whitmore never publicly apologized. Even in the wreckage of her social and financial ruin, she maintained that she had been the victim of a politically correct witch hunt. But her irrelevance was her true punishment. No one was listening anymore. That Daniel had learned the ultimate lesson of power. True victory wasn't in the destruction of the Whitmores, it was in using the platform their conflict had created to lift up the countless others who faced similar injustices. Every employee promoted on merit, every young person who discovered a talent at the community center, every family that benefited from the company's inclusive policies. Each was a more powerful response to prejudice than any public humiliation could ever be. 2 years later, when Daniel cut the ribbon at the 10th Carter Community Center to open in the country, his father stood beside him. Thomas used the same hands Victoria had once deemed fit only for manual labor to applaud a legacy. She could never have comprehended. The lesson was crystal clear, a beacon for all to see. When you have the courage to turn injustice into fuel, when you use prejudice not as a wound but as a blueprint to build something better, you don't just defeat your oppressors, you render them, and their hateful world, completely and utterly irrelevant. And there is no revenge more absolute, no victory more complete, than building a success so bright that your enemies realize they were never even worthy of your attention in the first place.